Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Higgins. I am the sales manager for Ohio, Western PA, and West Virginia. And I want to thank Chris Breen for allowing us to come today and present to you. Also on the line in the attendees, I have Trevor Lowe, who is our Senior Vice President of Sales and handles the Midwest. Trevor and I have worked together for about 20 years now, coming up through PR Newswire, if you're familiar with them, and on to Vintage, Topan Vintage, and now Topan Merrill. And we're very excited to be having this training with you. I have Mike Schlanger on the line, and he is going to be talking about SEC modernization, where it's going, what are we doing with XBRL, why are we doing it, and what can we look for in the future. Mike is a business leader and innovator with decades of experience in financial printing and focuses on developing transaction and compliance product strategies in response to client and regulatory needs. Mike leads a team of experts that guide the development and sales of Topan Merrill's SEC compliance and XBRL service offerings. Prior to joining Topan Merrill, he performed numerous roles with other companies, including sales, sales management, division president, and business development. Mike is currently serving as vice chairman of the board of XBRL US, which he has been a board member of since 2009. He's a frequent speaker at law firms, financial industry conferences, and professional associations on topics related to the SEC regulatory initiatives. With that, I'm going to let Mike take over the show. Mike?
Thank you, Lisa. And I would have loved to have been there in person. We all know why I'm not. And if you're noticing, my hair is out of shape. I've not had a haircut for 3 months. So I'm willing to expose that on video and get onto the program. My goal today is to provide you with insights into how the SEC is managing the influx of massive data and information. It's not a new problem, but it is a problem that has really escalated in this day of high technology, high-speed computers. And I hope to be able to provide you insights that will help you better understand this, the changes for your practice. And most importantly, if you view this from the eyes of your clients and customers, it might be able to provide you with some ways to communicate with them more effectively about this. You're going to see throughout the presentation references to XBRL. In fact, there's a lot of them. It's not about XBRL. It really is how the Commission is attempting to work with data to make it accessible and usable far better than it has. And XBRL is their lead program to do that. I'm aware that the legal community has not addressed this. I've done literally 50 of these programs, CLE programs at firms big and small across the country. And dutifully, there's an absence of deep knowledge and experience. And that is changing, as you'll see as I go through the presentation and why it's changing. I want to make this interactive. I have a couple questions. So Lisa's going to try to take your hand raise and get you to speak. They're simple questions, but I do want to start with one for whomever wants to address, and that's what, if any, engagements have you had with customers, your clients, about XBRL, and what's sort of the dynamic? I kind of know the answer, but I'm curious if you've had anything different than other firms. But if anyone can tell me how involved have you been with the XBRL rules, then we can get started with the program. Anyone?
Chris Breen, let's see if I can turn you on to talk. Oh. I'm only getting the chat button, Chris. Hold on 1 second.
There. Okay. Maybe
I'm
muted. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Okay, Chris.
Yes, we can hear.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think for most of us on this call, our exposure to XBRL, at least the details of it, has been quite limited with our clients. We're mostly just advising them as to whether their particular filings require XBRL documents in them. you know, what their content requirements are on a macro level, but not helping them, you know, tie numbers in their documents via XBRL or anything like that.
Right, and that's very common. So thanks for that, Chris. It is very common. One thing that I have at the end, if we have time, is a quiz, because there have been firms, some very big name firms, that have stubbed their toes on even giving good advice about when an XBRL exhibit is required. And so I do a quiz to have a comical way to address some key things where I've had to step in and override the attorney. I do it with the attorney, so it's not exposed to the client. But it's a quiz that at the end we can cover that, because I do know that's an area you do focus on. So with that, let me start with the first question that, you know, whether you have it on the tip of your tongue or not, why did the SEC do this in the first place? And we go back in time to address this, because you have to understand what problem they were trying to solve. And as you'll see, this is an age-old problem. And it's how to provide the users of SEC filed data access to information that they can analyze and do their work. And similarly with the commission has to be able to take that information and make it usable. When you look out and see, well, what is the commission challenge? Think of the SEC data, currently in sec.gov, as a reservoir of data. And imagine a pipeline has been built to plumb the data. And whether you're at the commission, whether you're an investment manager, whether you're a lawyer, getting access has been always a challenge for the commission. I normally ask the question, is anyone around during the paper days? And well, you know, maybe raise your hand or just say yes or no. I'll just assume someone in the audience has. For 60 years, imagine the SEC reservoir being just paper. Now, the way to mine or plumb that data, for those who are around, you might have called Disclosure Inc. And they would fax you or FedEx you the document you're looking for. You could go to the SEC library if you have one in your town. You can hopefully have some outlet in DC that would go and do that work for you. Or the traditional route would be contact your local printer and say, by the way, George Convertis or whomever your local sales rep, hey, do you have a copy of the S1 you just filed? In hindsight, it's a really archaic and comical way to plumb this data, but that's what the SEC dealt with, and that's what they understood was the challenge. In '93, after 10 years, they deployed the Edgar system. So think of Edgar as the Drano to clear the pipes that provided digital information that could be sucked out of the SEC reservoir through these pipes, and that spawned a revolution. And again, it seems, given how limited that data set is today under the current regime of the Edgar program, that changed the whole industry. And you had the cropping up of a whole new cottage industry of data aggregators who built facilities all over the world to take advantage of that digital flow. Now, the SEC realized this was limited, especially as the 2000s turned and the dot-com world, and you started having access to search engines like Google, and they only got better and better over the years. So try to search in the SEC database for a term, and you're gonna get thousands of pieces of information that are useless. You probably use IntelliGeyes or someone like that that puts it in a better capacity to use. But the SEC said there's gotta be a better way. And what they launched was this new format, as you see on the screen, very easy to read, very easy to understand and access if you're a computer. And this is one of the things I think most people fail to realize, that this is a computer translation, a human language translation to computers to facilitate instant computer analysis. So using XBRL software, I took one example. I think Park, Ohio, from your website, you do some work with. So I literally queried in the software, I put the 3 companies in, I say, give me revenues, and the revenues pop. But once they pop, I want to disaggregate the revenue. I want a better understanding. And so within the XBRL, with one keystroke, I can look at Park, Ohio's geographic and segment information. I can compare it to Mueller. And these can be in Excel files too. I'm just showing graphically because it's prettier. I can show trends of this, and then I go to Harsco, and I have an instant comparison right out of sec.gov through the use of that software. With Inline XBRL, which I'll cover in a little bit, not only can you read the human readable section, but if I click on that one value, with software overlaying the SEC software, I get a time series view, more than just the 2 or 3 years presented, and I can instantly benchmark against its peers. And I chose interest and dividend income from the primary Old National Bank peer group, just to give you a flavor of what you can get from the SEC. Now, as a consequence of this, the problem the SEC was trying to solve with the structured data, according to the head of the DERA group. Now, DERA stands for Division of Economic and Risk Analysis. Very few people know about this group. It's been likened to the brainchildren of the SEC. It started with 10 people 10 years ago. They have 150 accountants, lawyers, computer geeks, computer scientists, etc., that are now pulling information in to facilitate this easier access to allow for faster analysis for the commission to do its work. And its work is provide investors better information access for improving decision-making and do their job to reduce the ability of filers to commit fraud or not comply with the rules. And so the SEC has now, in their own view, realized benefits from this program. So I want to pause a second, and if someone can give me an answer to this, it's a simple question. What does Edgar stand for? And I do this. Most law firms get it wrong. They come close but get it wrong. One law firm thought it stood for someone's name. But can anyone quickly raise their hand and tell me, without Googling it, what does Edgar actually stand for?
We're kind of quiet, Mike.
Okay, I will take that. So let me go. Most people will say it's electronic data gathering and retrieval. And ironically, subliminally, that is what the Commission's Edgar database has been. Gather the information in one spot to allow for retrieval. What has been missed is the A, which stands for analysis. Now, this is important because many of your clients, the people on the financial reporting end, and I'm sure their legal counterparts, think XBRL is a waste of time. It's a flash in the pan. It's going to go away. Nobody's using it. And the reason I bring this up is to give you some foundation to realize that at the center of the Edgar vision in '84, and I'm going to say something it's an oxymoron. I'm going to say the SEC truly had a revolutionary vision, because in this document and in their view, the original purpose of Edgar was to provide one-day instant computer analysis. Now, the reason I think it's revolutionary, think back in '84, the Mac was just launched. Laptops were not around. The whole internet was long, from the time this was set up. But they had this vision that they could create a database that allowed computers to do heavy lifting analysis. And that's where the execution over years, and it took a long time, like the SEC will always do, it took years to get to where we are today. Now, little history, '93, the program began after 10 years of work. There was heavy opposition to Edgar, just like XBRL, but it worked through the kinks. The real power occurred when Edgar.gov, the SEC.gov was launched, and everyone had access to that information. But the SEC did not lose sight of that interactive or instant computer analysis. And I would ask this question, I'll do it rhetorically, who remembers Exhibit 27? This was there for about 5 or 6 years, fell by the wayside. But Exhibit 27 was a crude attempt to create an instant computer program analysis of like terms. As you know, in financial statements, each company has its own way of reporting on information under the US GAAP requirements. In this case, the SEC said, let's create a taxonomy or a data dictionary of defined terms and have everybody fill it in. Now, my favorite story here is I was working with Chrysler on a big stock offering, and they totally forgot this exhibit in one of their periodic reports. I went to them and said, hey, can you get this, because you got to file it? And they said, we're too busy, Mike, go fill it out. Now, I'm not an accountant. I used to sleep at Holiday Inn Express. I said, sure, I'll try it. I opened up the financial statements and I found none of the terms in this report, the FDS schedule, was what Chrysler was reporting on. So I'm going to key on one and come back to this. Just think of bonds, and no one just has a line item bonds, but it didn't work. No one really understood it. If anyone's on the phone remembering it, and it went by the wayside. And as the emergence of the internet occurred, and especially today, what became obvious is Edgar was not sufficient. The benefit of Edgar was easy access to digital unstructured data. Think of a pipe, go into that reservoir, and that data gets sucked all over the world. And the challenge was, how do you mine the database? Either you have significant internal resources scrubbing the data, or like most people, they look for a third-party aggregator. Again, IntelliGize, I know, is very dominant in the law firms. Bloomberg, CompuStat, CapIQ are institutions that are out there, but it's a time-consuming and manual process and costly. It's prone to interpretations of disclosures because someone else is identifying, what you're saying. It's rife with errors and quality issues. And I'll use ISS, Institutional Shareholder Services, as an example. Although they're not dealing with XBRL data, they are dealing with proxy data. And they have over 500 people in the Philippines, and all they do is collect proxy statements and fill in spreadsheets, fill in databases. And as I'm sure you're aware, certain companies have actually filed 8Ks contending with the ISS interpretation or findings. So it's not a perfect world of data aggregation. It's in financial information, it's typically a subset of what a company presents. They don't even cover the full face financial statements, let alone footnotes. And lastly, it's created an unlevel playing field where the benefactors of these sources of information are those who can afford it, leaving the middle to average investors just not having access to the information. XBRL became the approach, or structured data became the approach that the SEC chose to address this issue. And the first success for the SEC came in the Section 16 filings, when they went from paper to electronic. And instead of just building an Edgar system the way it was, they created something a little bit beyond that. Now, this is what I'm sure you all know, and I'm going to make an assumption. If I was in person, I would say, are you familiar, and who does this? You might have someone in your firm that does it. You might outsource to some company, or you might have tools you use. But ultimately, you're filling in a form with data. Pretty innocent form, and it looks like you're just filling it in like you would for registering for a driver's license or car registration or whatever. What the commission did differently, though, is they built on the back end structured data, extensible markup language, so that every value went into that form was assigned a certain structure that allowed the computer now to manage all those 3, 4, and 5 filings. And the success of this was noted by Chris Cox, former SEC chairman. And he said, once we began to have this interactive format, we found clues that had previously gone undetected. Now, if you can quickly, anyone tell me what they caught using this new structured data? I need a drink of water, so I get 10 seconds to answer that question. What was it? What was the big discovery they found early on in the 2000s, mid-2000s?
No takers on that question, Mike.
There's what? No takers?
No takers.
All right, I'll give you the answer. Backdating of stock options, billions of dollars. Now think of this. What you had was data that was structured. So every option granted had a date, had a strike price, had a timeline when it would be done, and et cetera, et cetera. With that structured data, they could build a computer program to identify anomalies, in this case, date anomalies. As I've studied this, it appears that there was a report in the Wall Street Journal. Someone tipped him off that the backdating of options occurred with 1 or 2 companies. And even though it was legal to do at the time, it was illegal if you didn't disclose it. So what the SEC did was take that kind of whistleblower and scrub the data through the computers, and this is what they were able to do. Prosecute hundreds of companies, leveling fines, some of them significant, that they would never have caught if they tried to go through and manually walk through those files. Now, for me, the most interesting comment and experience that I learned when I studied this was the chairman of Brocade was convicted, and ultimately his case was thrown out. But as you see, they had a $7 million penalty they had to pay. His assistant under deposition was asked what was going on. And the assistant said, I asked my chairman that question. And his response was, or he asked the question if it's legal or not. And the response was, it's not illegal if you don't get caught. Now, if you think of the commission, what's its purpose is to improve transparency, improve the visibility to root out any kind of bad actors or fraud. And in this case, using structured data allowed them to find something that they probably would have had a hard time finding in mass like they did. This emboldened Cox to launch XBRL. So my last question like this, can anyone tell me what XBRL stands for? I think I'm gonna have to answer it, but if anyone wants to take a stab. Okay, I'm gonna give you the
That's great of you.
I guess so. It's not the best format. I appreciate, if I was one-on-one, I get it. So I'll just not ask questions again. I'll do them rhetorically. So XBRL stands for Extensible Business Reporting, and I'm keen on the L, which is language. And the reason I'm doing this is your clients, the financial reporting people, generally speaking, have a misconception of what XBRL is. They believe that what they're doing is similar to what the SEC asked them to do with that financial data schedule. Match your disclosures, your values representing revenue, cost of goods with the corresponding tag in the XBRL dictionary or XBRL taxonomy. And in that way, it's more of a matching and tagging exercise. My point today, it's a language, and we're going to get into that in a few minutes to show where companies have fallen short and consequences of falling short. So first, let's define XBRL a little bit. It's a global standard. It's in hundreds of countries. China, Japan, all these countries have their own kind of XBRL. Most of them fall into what we would know as a paint by numbers approach. Similar to the financial data schedule, we're giving you a term like bonds, and let's say bonds is number 2. So wherever number 2 is, you put in your number for bonds. This is being used in the US by the FDIC, their call reports. It's been there for over 11 years, and it's touted as one of the highest, most successful programs of XBRL. It's eliminated a lot of problems, inconsistent data, and it's really working. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is mandated all FERC filers to file annual reports in XBRL coming in 2020. So it's gonna be their 2021 reports. And it's growing, as I'll show you, in other jurisdictions as well, but it's a very widespread use. The difference for the US though, is we didn't do the paint by numbers. We said, here's a blank canvas, and we're gonna give you 15,000 colors representing all the concepts in US GAAP for you to paint your company's story. However, if the color we've had in the taxonomy isn't good for you, you can mix up the colors and create a custom color or an extension. And although the SEC allows it, there's a lot of issue over companies doing too many custom colors that obfuscate the information to the point that it's hard to compare companies. And I'll show you an example of that shortly. So just as a level set, what's the current SEC requirements? You're all familiar, 10Qs, 10Ks. If you have foreign issuers, 20F and 40Fs. An 8K or 6K, if there's updated versions and you're presenting your audited financials with some revisions, that requires an XBRL exhibit. But inline is required. It's a phase-in that's occurring right now. With that, when someone does get into the phase-in, first Q filed inline XBRL, their first 8K after that requires the cover to be tagged. The cover tagging is relatively simple, but I know it struck a lot of law firms, and there were memos and all kinds of information that wasn't right initially, but it's gotten worked out that I think everyone is well aware of that requirement today. The 33 Act is where we see a lot of misinformation being delivered. The basic rule is if you incorporate financial statements by reference, there's no requirement for an XBRL exhibit. If you present your financial statements, then there is a requirement. And that's part of the test I have, because there's some examples that are not cut and dry that have happened that we've had to step in and offer other advice. Lastly, on the requirement, this is the most detailed I would get in the weeds, and it's not really in the weeds. The requirement is 4 levels of tagging. There's 3 levels, which are block text tagging. And all this means is for the significant accounting policies, each one has its own tag. For the whole footnote and for the tables, they have tags to understand why. If I want an income tax footnote from 5 companies, I can query the database and get all 5 companies' income tax footnote or corresponding tables or accounting policies at my fingertips instantly. Where your clients suffer is on this level 4, where every value in the face financial statements and footnotes is tagged. And there's a lot of work, and that's why initially people were very upset with this. Even today, staying current with the changes in the taxonomy, it requires a lot of effort to have the right tag selected, etc. Now, what's the challenge here? Again, from the vantage point of your customer, most of them see this as tagging, and they miss that it's actually a translation. So what we have is we're taking human thought, a brain viewing this disclosure can read it and understand it, a computer can't. So the art of XBRL is to translate it so that this language, this format, is discernible by the computer, so the computer can generate a comparable view of the financial statements that the human can, just like in any human language translation, and then process it to create this instant information. Another example here is I took 3 companies, the stock buybacks. As you see, they rose over time in most of these companies. It'll be interesting to see what happens a year from now, but I could have put hundreds of companies into this query, and within 1 keystroke, I've got a vision of what's going on because the computer understands the disclosure enough to be able to present this information to me. Okay? Now, a lot of your filers are taking shortcuts, and so what I want to emphasize is give you some background on what the language translation looks like, and I'm using first human language because the same prerequisites for good translation apply to XBRL, and they're simple. If I'm translating a complex legal document or a physics book, I want to make sure my translator understands that thoroughly. I'm not going to hire a sports management major to do that, even if he's fluent or she's fluent in the language. The translator has to have full comprehension of the language. They got to dream in that language to make sure they can do it right. And third and fourth, they understand limitations of word for word or machine translation. Certainly there's a lot of dictionary work, but you're not taking a French dictionary to get a French-English dictionary to translate French and just doing the words. You know what happens then. And lastly, if it's complex, your goal is to make sure that translator understands what they're doing, and you have a verification process where you talk to them and say, by the way, this is complex disclosure on let's say a debenture, warrants. Can you tell me you understand it so you translate it right? But what happens when shortcuts are taken? Got some famous examples in human language. Pepsi launched in Taiwan, Come Alive with the Pepsi generation, for those who remember that, was translated, drink Pepsi or bring your ancestors back from the dead. Or Yum Brands, KFC, finger licking good, in China was translated initially as you'll eat your fingers off. And then Parker Pen, bless them, said it won't leak in your pocket and embarrass you, became it won't leak in your pocket and make you pregnant. Now, obviously, someone took shortcuts in this process. I'm going to get into why this is relevant. XBRL is a language with major components similar to human language translation. And if you take shortcuts, you have exposure to similar embarrassing results. So here's the components. Remember that financial data schedule on bonds? Well, one term became, and this is just one section, long-term debt excluding current maturities. You see there are multiple items you can select from. Now, it's not just a naming convention match. Your filer, your client has to go in and read the definition for any of those in order to at least select the right tag. So like human language, you do have dictionary work. But where it gets complicated is there's rules and grammar. Now, I need a drink of water, so take a second and read the first sentence. And since no one's going to come back and tell me they don't know it, I'm going to assume you're to read this and say, I have no idea what this means. But take a minute to read. A second, not a minute. These are the rule set, 50-some pages that you have to master to do this right. Now, I've spent 12 years talking to companies, and my list, I stopped counting over 3,000. It's probably about 3,500. I've only met a few people that said they read the rules, and I asked, well, what was your response? What did you get out of it? I said, I have no idea what I read. We have CPAs on staff. We have over 50 in St. Paul, and these individuals are senior accounting professionals, and they said it took a year to master these rules, to be able to be fully fluent. A lot of companies providing services have not spent that time and kind of do a mediocre job, and they certainly don't convey that to their customers. As a consequence, it's really easy to make a mistake in XBRL. There's also structure. Think about diagramming sentences in English. You know, there's a structure to XBRL that if you don't follow, you run the risk that your disclosure is not going to be telling the right story. And lastly, as a new language, there's FAQs, staff interpretations, all these things that are updating. The taxonomy updates annually. Many companies do not keep up with that, and they're making bonehead mistakes as a consequence. So if my premise is XBRL is similar to a human language that requires deep understanding of all components, like, as I said, number one, you have an accounting professional working with you, or you as an accounting professional master these rules. You're not going to, again, have a sports management major do this translation. You got to be fluent in the language. You need to understand that there's word for word and machine translation that gets done, but know its limitations. And lastly, make sure the person you're working with can prove they understand your disclosure. We worked with AIG right after the financial crisis. And their first effort of translating XBRL, we asked, how did you do it? Who did you work with? And then I said, do you ever talk to the people who did the translation? And their comment was no. And if you go back and prove this yourself in 2009, look at the footnotes on the derivatives of AIG. And our accounting professionals had problems understanding the English, let alone translating it properly. And so this really highlighted the challenge that you've got to have knowledgeable people who work with customers who don't have the time to master the rule set. So my hypothesis is, again, if you take shortcuts, what happens, here's a recent example. American Express, in their disclosure, purchased 15 million shares. The way it was read by the computer was a negative 15 million shares were purchased. The value was entered with the wrong sign. But think about it. Unless Amex is shorting its own self, which I don't think that goes on, this is just a bad, bad mistake, right? Or Yum Brands ate their fingers off again. And although this was a number of years ago, this still happens. They reported outstanding shares of 360 quadrillion shares. Now, when you pull a graph, you say, oh, Yum Brands went public and private in the same quarter. because there's no way to compare those other values. Another mistake was made. And then Ameriprise had a different one. They just didn't disclose, or they didn't tag the particular number that quarter, so they show up as having 0 public float. So taking shortcuts, as I'll show, is something that is unfortunately all too common in XBRL. Now, a caveat is, as bad as some of these errors are and as rife they are throughout, a lot of the information, the data in XBRL is usable and sufficient to really gain traction and value. But the SEC and others, especially the data aggregators, the people who have the software and pulling the data, are frustrated that it's not quite up to speed as it should be. Now, this is important because up until now, XBRL really has not been utilized. If I asked the filers I talked to all the time 3 years ago and said, do you think anyone's using it? Their answer was absolutely not. No investor has ever asked us about XBRL. Maybe the SEC is using it. Now people are saying, well, I think the SEC is using it, but I don't know what they're doing with it. So to give you that grounding, I want to cover exactly where we stand in the use of XBRL, because that heightens the importance of getting it right. Scott Balgus, former DIRA deputy director, laid out succinctly, we're using XBRL to cover 100% of the filers. Now, if you have small companies, many small companies think they're under the radar of the watch of the SEC. And in the old days, that's true. But now think of this. Every quarter, the SEC has the means to pull data and instantly view a couple hundreds of metrics, whether you're the tiniest biotech all the way up to Amazon, and slice that information in a way they've never had access before. To do this, they've got 3 basic tool sets. CalcBench, which is a software like Audacity. I'm showing you Audacity pools. Audacity was a contractor to the SEC. CalcBench licenses software to enforcement and others, and they have 150 licenses. And under the COVID environment, I hear their software has been pounded to get the information about the potential risks associated with COVID impact on financial statements. But they have a homegrown dashboard called the Corporate Issuer Risk Assessment Dashboard. And this, I'm not going to go through these details. It basically, though, combines purchase data from CompuStat and a few other sources and XBRL. And as they say, they are covering 200 variables for all the registrants that they want to. So a powerful tool set. And what they're fueling is the ability for the commission to do its work. First and foremost, they're fulfilling their requirement to keep Congress, IRS, Treasury involved. They're constantly, the DIRA group constantly gets information requests from them, and they're able to fulfill them quickly. Example, 3-4 years ago, the whole issue of unremitted foreign earnings, the earnings overseas, they got a request from Congress, can you get the information? They pulled it within minutes. They probably could have pulled it faster, but a number of companies extended it. But they were able to get a chart of public companies parking revenue and earnings overseas in seconds because of that. The SEC divisions, CorpFin. CorpFin has been slow. They require DIRA to do most of the work, but there's a new query tool that's beginning to take hold with CorpFin. The OCIE and enforcement. Enforcement's a power user. I'll get into that in a few minutes. And what they're doing is they're taking the data, again, on a quarterly basis. If they're looking at trends, like right now, COVID's going to be hot. So they're going to look at the trends of COVID and be able to provide really powerful insights as a consequence. They can take company by size, by peer group, by jurisdiction, and be able to do analyses on these hundreds of metrics that are built into the programs they've built. They look for outliers. They can identify when there's an absence of disclosure. All these new accounting standards, they're looking for how people are complying, and if they're complying, if they're timely, etc. So they've got this, and this is how the commission's using it. And then enforcement, Howard Kaplan spoke at several events, including one of our own, and he said, when we identify or when we have a hypothesis of potential wrongdoing in financial disclosure, we start with XBRL. That's where we start our investigation, because it gives us that instant view to see if there's, we can compare one company against 50 to see if that company is in line with the others, etc. And they've been able to trace, successful prosecutions, enforcement prosecutions, where XBRL played a critical role to that. Now, again, from the financial reporting side and the CFO side, the common theme is no one's using it. We don't have to do our best in the like, and I'll get into that in a minute. But the fact is they have to understand this is being used at the commission. And you would hope so. The market. Here's where there's been a slow churning adoption. And it ranges from Moody's. Moody's now is building infrastructure to process the data to do its work. Bloomberg has been in and out, but they've got a task force constantly doing it. Goldman Sachs did a pension report. The individual responsible in the annual pension report said he went to CapIQ, Bloomberg, Intelligize, and others, and he didn't get what he needed. He employed Audacity and built this report, and he said, I did it faster and faster and better than I ever have because of the depth of information in XBRL that's in those footnotes. And others are all hedge funds. Just to give you an idea, third largest hedge fund in the country is using XBRL to process information on small companies. They don't have the staff and focus to do what they do with large companies, so they employ XBRL, and they might be looking for companies heading towards a leverage problem, a covenant problem, and they're using that to fulfill their research needs to manage what they do in the market, good or bad. Now with this, the question is more coming? Your client would say, I sure hope not. Reality is it's going where they don't want it to. Now I met with a small group in 2016 with Kara Stein, former commissioner. What she laid out is sort of the operative vision that's been there under Jay Clayton. And that's that wherever, first off, we've been behind in the use of data. She likened the $9 billion technology spend that one commercial bank spends compared to the $200 or $300 million the SEC does. And even though that spend is not just on data, her point was we've been woefully behind, but we're catching up, and we're looking at every new rule, every new form type, or old form types where we're changing to see if there's any practical application to XBRL. Good example is on MD&A. They've posed the question, is there a possibility that structured data would apply there? Reality is you're not going to get the granular XBRL you have in the financials, but you can block text sections that when employed can really facilitate deep digging into that MD&A content. In terms of, are they executing on this structured data vision? And they are. Inline filing is an example. I will show you that momentarily. But the first group came in last year. The second group is coming in this quarter. Third group, third quarter, or another year from now. And what you can see here is new tools at the disposal of those who are mining that SEC data site. Now, what I'm going to show you is what's there first. And it might not be that significant to you, but as you can see, you have human readable data. And then if you click on a number, you have the metadata that can be useful. But that metadata allows you to do various queries that are on the top bar. I would call it a first approximation research tool. It's only going to get better. And you can query various things and get results. But where it's going is what Audacity is doing. So here's a simple example. That number in the right-hand side that has a square around it, I clicked on that number and instantly had a time series more than what it's presented. So I can look at the pattern and trend of that company. I can go dig into it with a number of things that are not worth going through here. But the second thing I can do, and this is straight from sec.gov with the software. So I don't have to wait weeks. I don't have to pay $10,000 a month to get my Bloomberg terminal. I get instant comparison of my peers. Now I did this for KeyCorp. I know on your website you've done some work for them. Financing receivables past due. So I can look at this and I can see KeyCore against its peers, and I'm sure we're going to see that chart grow. But that's seconds. All I did was plug in those 4 names and identify what I'm looking for. I didn't even identify, I just clicked on the number and I got that view. And that's the power of XBRL. Now, other mandates coming. I know you have investment management. You do some. I'm not going to go through these rules. I have 2 slides. I'm just referencing, be aware that closed-end funds and business development corporations have significant XBRL tagging coming in the future. The closed-end funds it's not an accounting tagging, but it's going to be a lot of technical work to get those prospectuses tagged properly. BDCs have Q and K requirements, so that's financial accounting. There are about 100 BDCs across the country, and they also have a similar prospectus tagging. Variable life annuities have some things happening. And then for the world of the 3334 Act, proposed rules on fee data tagging, and there's some others that are out that are hanging. But the SEC is going full speed on some areas, and this is for your reference on what's going on with the mutual fund work. Is proxy on the agenda? Robert Jackson left the SEC, but before he left, he had stated his objective was to put the data aggregators out of business. He said it kind of tongue-in-cheek, but his point was the world has gotten turned upside down. And he had his sights on ISS and Glass Lewis, where he said these individuals collect the information and they have the power to influence the market. They certainly provide information to the institutions on voting. They do consulting, they do research. But his point was all this information can be easily tagged today in the proxy. The summary comp table, the proxy card, director information. And his point was if we tag that, it would allow institutions like ISS to devote more time on analysis, allow others to do time and analysis rather than taking 500 people, the cost of that to build these data sets. But it will also give the average investor or smaller institutions the ability to slice and dice the data as if they were ISS. So just an example of the direction. The only 2 XBRL requirements on proxy today are in proposal are clawback and the pay versus performance. Both of them are not on the agenda soon, so we don't know what's happening with them. But be aware this could go into the future. Other areas like 8K, item number tagging is most likely going to hit. MD&A, it's in the proposed rules that we should consider XBRL. So again, if you read the rules thoroughly as we do, you'll see snippets of should we use this, is this a possibility, etc. I mentioned this before, FERC is launching this. This is for your reference if you have any FERC reporters. I saw an energy company in your thing, so they might be asking, be aware of this. Overseas, if you have any US companies that list on a European exchange, they have a requirement coming with their year-end 2020 financials. Most files will happen in the March to April period next year. So the question of quality, I brought it up. Why should this matter to your customer? I'll give you an example of what I'm going to name the name because at this point, they're not a client and I'm willing to name it. I met with the chief accounting officer of ICE, International Continental Exchange. They own New York Stock Exchange as well as others, a lightly regulated institution. So you would think the CAO would be all over making sure their regulatory affairs are in order. I asked them what they're doing about quality. Are they concerned? He said, you know, we put the time in to do our best, but the SEC is not penalizing anybody. We don't see any use of it, and we'll do our very, very best. Now, we did an XBRL review and highlighted a number of errors that were embarrassing. They said they would do something about it, but that, unfortunately, is the prevailing tune within the financial reporting world. I've met with legal professionals. I was at the corporate governance group in Atlanta, the Southeast chapter. I had Elizabeth Graves, a litigator from Wilkie Farr, and Julie Marler from the SEC. And we shocked these people with how at risk they are. And again, the risk is relative, but the question is, does their Edgar and XBRL files match? And the legal group finally has kind of woken up. And so in a number of meetings, they've driven the financial reporting people to do a little bit more, at least, to get their XBRL better. But why does it matter? well, Mike Willis is a big player at the SEC. And his point is the more we use XBRL, the more obvious and aware we are, as well as the market is, of the errors in the filing. What have they done? And this gets to the issue of, well, here's the issue of custom tags. Remember, I said I'd cover that. Simple, and this is from the SEC slides, a simple disclosure item, R&D expense. Mike asked the group he was presenting, who's missing? Well, you can't answer. I'm not going to make an answer. It's Amazon. And why is Amazon missing? Because they did a custom tag for a simple disclosure like R&D. And this is a challenge the SEC has. So they look at this as they get into the question, why would Amazon do that? And you'll see in a second why. Now, in terms of XBRL quality, there's something that every company's what's the word? Every company has access to this dashboard. XBRL US, as it was mentioned, I'm vice chair of the board. We chair this group, DQC. And it's made up of a consortium of users of data, accounting firms, and other players like us. This has been adopted for the taxonomy this year by FASB. So although the SEC will say they don't endorse it, FASB's under their watch. So we know, and we know personally, that they watch this XBRL US data quality. What it is a rule sets that you can run your files through and get a portion of your filings verified and validated before you file. What's critical is the filer has to understand what the computer can't do. And that's a bigger story, but the fact is, this is only a small set. I have companies I met with. A big company the other day thought that when they filed with Edgar and they get through the Edgar system, the SEC has validated everything in the file, which is the furthest thing from the truth. The SEC does no XBRL quality validation through the Edgar system. So where companies have used this, you go back to 2015, there were almost 22,000 errors for values entered with the wrong sign. You see, by using the DQC, we've gotten down to 5,000, but 5,000 values entered wrong in the market? I've been involved in so many meetings in my early days with accounting and legal professionals working on a draft, and fights break out over rounding of small numbers, or comma versus colon, or phrases used. How could you accept signage? And I'm going to show you one. I showed you one earlier, but I'm going to show you one right now. And again, the question the filer needs to ask, the lawyers were trying to get at the company to say, do our files sync? Does our XBRL file tell the same story? Well, the XBRL US has a public dashboard. So all your filer clients can be seen whether they have errors or not. And most companies are compliant. But as you see at the bottom, you got Toll Brothers, you got Steve Madden, you got others that have errors. And this is now just a small section of the XBRL. Here's a Fortune 100 company. If I told you the name, it wouldn't be shocking, but you can see their latest filing has a lot of errors. Now, if a company puts themselves merely review before they file, they would be flagged. This is an error from that company. And it reports that you're using the wrong sign on a $4.6 billion disclosure. Again, how do these people sleep at night? And they don't even, it's like, the fights break out over if that was 4.658001000 or something, but a negative 4.6 billion is substantial. In the Edgar, it's properly put in. So in the Edgar, it does enter as a negative value. But if you understand the XBRL rule and this particular taxonomy element, it's required to have a value entered as a positive value. Since it wasn't, here's the company's defined benefit plan payment. So it says that the company had a negative $4.6 billion submitted for that pension plan year. Again, you can't miss the mistake. Recommendations for filers, just so you know, we can do this offline if you want. They've got to run their files through the DQC validation as a first step. There are other validation tools out there, but this is one of the better ones. You've got to assess their competency and know what they know and know what they don't know, where they need help. Now, one of the challenges, there's software out there that make it easy for people to do it themselves. and there are companies doing this on their own, and they're the ones, big and small, making the biggest amount of errors. Or others are outsourcing, but don't do any review. I'll get to that in a minute. We think the best approach is what we've adopted. This is not a commercial for us. There are others doing this, not in the same way. But you got to be able to work with a professional that is fluent in XBRL and accounting and can guide you along the way to make sure you know what you need to know and see, even though you're not going to be the expert. So here's one of your customers that you report you work with, Chart Industries. This is no offense to the company, no offense to you because you have no involvement, but they have 7 errors in one of their filings. And you can see in this case, they have a negative 4.8 million. The disclosure is de minimis, it's not that critical. But there's a reason I'm bringing this up as a public dashboard. And that's because what is the risk you have? Well, first and foremost, the filer's liable. Mistakes in that file carry the same weight of liability as Edgar. No one's been charged putting the dog house or no suits have happened, but that was the stick the SEC thought would get the best compliance and still sticks. Here's where it gets interesting. So the SEC has done limited stuff. They did a Dear CFO letter. They've hired members now to look at this more closely. They're starting to communicate by phone. In one communication, a company said, I leave the quality to my vendor. And the Corp Fin person on the phone said, and who's responsible for the filing data? Because they had a lot of errors. Future actions, more CFO letters are likely, maybe comment letters, and enforcement, I was told it's too costly to enforce. However, if it gets to the point we don't get compliance, it might be something in our tool bag. But what Mike has said, and this is at the DERA group, they're looking at the DQC dashboard, you know it, because they just have put that in the taxonomy. There could be identification of lack of controls and processes. And his point is, when we see persistent errors, we will wonder whether the processes in place are strong and being followed. And when we suspect it's not, we throw them in a bucket for further review. Okay, so you could be flagged. You might have a pristine Edgar file, but if your XBRL file has issues, they're going to flag you. Amended filings have happened. I'm just going to breeze through in the interest of time. Reputational risk. Companies have been called out for major errors. This is an older one, but kind of my poster child. They get called out in India where they have lots of people working, and you wake up and you see that a regulatory filing has a $100 billion mistake. But then enforcement says the same as Mike Willis. When we see this kind of error, consistent error, and the guys from New York, he said, it's like a cockroach. When you find one, you wonder what else is in those filings. And at that point, you stop looking at XBRL and you look at the filing and methodology of the company and throw this in a bucket for further review. Lastly, Elizabeth Gray, who's been very outspoken, former SEC Assistant Director of Enforcement, was special counsel to Art Levitt, and now litigation chair at Wilkie Farr, SEC litigation. She said, filers have to understand the information advantage, which the filer had all the way up through the Edgar days, has shifted where the SEC is having that advantage. Her point is they may have insight into issues you're unaware. When you start querying and showing anomalies, there could be anomalies that are appropriate. You earn more than anyone else, but there are other anomalies that put you out of whack that you're going to get scrutinized. And her point for internal and external counsel is to review the policies and controls in place and look at the potential vulnerabilities you need to close that gap if they exist. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to stop here. I'll cover this test if we want, but I'd like to open up for questions. And get a sip of water too.
If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A.
Or can't they raise their hand and unmute? Yeah.
Yes. And I am getting nothing. I think we wowed them all.
I don't know. Because of I'm going to do, this is usually a real interactive session. Let me just give you a couple of things that were inaccurate advice. SEC registrant S4 is a private company registering to buy an existing public company. In fact, this was a SPAC. So the private company wanted to register its shares to buy the SPAC. Counsel said that you need to include an XBRL exhibit. This is a Friday before a Monday filing, and they wanted to work the weekend and cost $100,000 to get this done. I was involved. I stepped in and said, you know what? You don't need to do it. It's not a requirement. It's the first filing of the registrant. So in that case, even though they're presenting their financial statements, it's not required for XBRL. Similarly, we have an IPO, has successful IPO. They're presenting their financial statements in the prospectus and an S1 within 9 months. Is an XBRL required? Counsel said no. The requirement was yes, and they had a little bit of egg on their face. This one is an important one. Registrant was incorporating its financials by reference. So the S4 of its registration was by reference. The acquired company was presenting F pages. Counsel advised the acquired company to file XBRL. The fact is, the trigger is the registrants, not the acquired company. Lastly, where was this one? 10K, first 34 act after filing the IPO. The counsel advised filing. There's no requirement. The SEC gives you a pass on that first filing unless it's a 10Q. So I've got nothing more. If there are any questions that came up in that last little piece, I'm willing to answer. Certainly offline, we'd be willing to talk, but anyone have a question?
Hey, it's Chris Spreen. I don't have a question, Mike. I just wanted to thank you for this presentation, for all of us here advising clients who are filers. As I said at the outset, really have only a surface level knowledge, I think, of XBRL and how the SEC uses it, and also what our clients are doing to comply with it. So getting this insight is really eye-opening, certainly from my perspective, and I think for a lot of the rest of us as well. So not to preempt anybody's question, but just wanted to make sure I made that comment and say thanks for this. It's much appreciated. Yeah.
And the limited thing I would recommend is just, you can go to that DQC. You've got, I think you'll get the slides. I give you an address, web address. You can check your clients and see if they have errors. It's improved a lot. If you go back in time, you're going to see a lot of errors, but I noticed chart. I think another one had it. Some of these are, like the chart one, I talked to our professional and said, no one's going to bother with that piece of information. But again, it's flagged as an error. And I think the company needs to address its own processes, because what's hidden under that DQC dashboard are the things that require human subjective interpretation about how the XBRL needs to be presented. And that's where you find a lot of things that are not evident to the people, especially if they're doing it themselves. They just don't have the time. And they've been sold a bill of goods by some software companies that it's so easy to do, and it is, to build these files, but they really are doing a disservice to themselves. And I get it, because I work very closely with the two big software companies. They're small companies, but CalcBench and Audacity, and they're complaining all the time about how poor some of the XBRL data is. Yet they are really delivering, and it's only going to help everybody. So yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think at least half of our clients are doing this themselves, if not more. So the fact that you were able to find 7 errors for chart just by looking at that dashboard, suggests to me that there's certainly more than just that out there. So I think that's real valuable information we can help our clients understand better.
Yeah.
And Chris,
go ahead.
Chris, let me put this out there to you and the team. If you guys want to do this with bringing in certain clients, we can certainly sit down with you, those clients, Mike, and go through and look at some of their errors and do this presentation more on online for them, and where we're seeing things and give them suggestions. We have done this in the past with several clients in the room, and they find it very valuable.
I think that could be real value. I think we'll discuss that internally and see, you know, how best to bring that to our clients' attention, and then maybe get you involved as we have a chance to discuss that with them. Because for some of them, they may, you know, they may just kind of poo-poo it anyway, as you know, not see it as a high risk. But I'm sure others will be more interested to learn more. So that would be great.
Sure. Okay. Sounds good. Just let me know.
And not just want to add one comment that I think is missed in all this, and I know I'm a little over, but I do want to make it. What's fascinating about XBRL, I mentioned data aggregators, and it literally is data banks of smart professionals in India, Philippines, whatever, and they're taking a filing, and they're, whatever limited data set they provide back, they're interpreting a lot, and it comes back. What's so powerful about XBRL, and this is why the financial reporting, the CFO office has to understand this, is by them really taking to heart the value of XBRL, they're providing a solution, a structure that whatever goes through that pipeline is going to retain what they told the file to tell the user. So when you have some, you know, like a good example, IBM's intellectual property income came back from the data aggregators as other income. It wasn't wrong, but IBM specified it as intellectual property income. So to have that flow through the data process is powerful. And Audacity, which is a company, a small company, when they get asked, how do you compete with Bloomberg? They say, wait a minute, we've got the company professionals who know their information better than anybody, giving us instructions on the structure of all the financial information. We're just facilitating the use and processing of that. And I would hope companies would realize this is really a chance to get above the scrutiny of, not the scrutiny, the massaging of data by people who aren't themselves, who oftentimes come back with bad data. And SEC and Price Waterhouse did a study early on in XBRL. They said 25% of the data that comes through to the Yahoo Finances and all these other institutions are either wrong, misleading, misinterpreted, or hazy. So a company has a chance to really put itself out there in a profound way. So that's the last thing I have to say. I apologize for going over a few minutes. Maggie or Chris, I'll leave it to you, and we'll close out.
Well, nothing further from my side. No, thanks again, Mike, for all of that insight, which we appreciate. And again, not something we were real familiar with before this. So it's great to learn today.
And any questions, you've got my information at the back of the slides. I think I've got it here, and also Lisa's. And I put it, just so you see, there's an appendix that has other information of what I covered, more information on the mutual fund requirements. So with that, I'm going to sign off. Thank you. Have a great day and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.